Hey all, welcome to my presentation tonight for Fiveable on voting and voting behavior for AP US Government and Politics. All right, I'll just get these slides started, but if you're out there and watching, please do say hi just so I know. So as always, Think Fiveable at Think Fiveable is where you can find us on social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. Feel free to let us know how these streams are going, ask us questions, or as always, if there's a topic that we might not have covered that you would like us to cover, we're always open to suggestions of what direction we can take these streams. And as always, my cats are making themselves known. Well, we're going to look at what does we the people mean, right? We hear all the time, we the people, but in terms of voting, what does that phrase actually mean? Then we're going to break it down as far as the history of voting in the United States. So starting with who had the rights to vote first in this country, bringing it all the way up to today. We'll look at some figures about those who vote in our country, those who don't vote in our country. We'll break it down by demographics according to gender, ethnicity, and religion. We'll look at several different voting models, so looking at the why and the how of how people actually vote. And then we'll look at the types of ballots that are used in this country. So we have a jam-packed stream tonight. I know we normally do some practice multiple choice questions at the end, but we have so much to cover this evening that I don't actually think there will be time for them. And as always, as I'm going, hey Dakota, it's great to see you again tonight. Thanks for joining. As always, as I'm going through this, if you have questions, just shout them out. Usually what I do is as I get to the end of each slide, I take some time to answer any questions. Again, it's a lot of information, so I might talk fast, so please feel free to let me know, slow it down, and ask the questions that you might have. So let's jump right into this, and we're going to jump at looking at we the people. Is it actually we the people who get to make, Frankie, come on. Is it actually we the people who are making the decisions in this country when it comes to voting? And that's what we're going to start off talking about. Just to get some key terms out of the way, suffrage is just the idea of people being qualified to have the right to vote. And it's important to understand that our founding fathers, the folks who wrote our Constitution, really allowed in the beginning for state governments to determine suffrage. So starting at the very roots of our country, what we saw was the fact that each state had different rules as to who could vote and who could not vote. And also our state governments are really the ones who are in charge of running elections as well. What we started to see during the year is that there'd be different constitutional amendments added to allow all adult citizens the franchise or the right to vote, so to speak. And so that's important to understand. But if we're looking at we the people itself, what's important to understand when our country first started, for the most part, we the people meant white men who owned property. In the very beginning, most states had laws that said you had to be a white male and you had to own property in order to be a part of the electorate, meaning be a part of the people who go to the polls. That's changed through the years, and as we kind of continue going with this, we'll talk about when and how our electorate began to expand. And how our voting age population changed. Our voting age population today means citizens who are over the age of 18. And then we're going to talk about specifically what voting age population meant through different time periods as we discuss American history. Those of you who took APUSH last year will probably recognize some of the things that we are going to talk about tonight. So just, again, going through a brief history of voting and what it looked like in our country. So very beginning, qualifications, you had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to own property. During the presidency of Andrew Jackson, so now we're getting into the 1820 time period. During that time period, Andrew Jackson ran on the whole idea that he was going to be the president of the common person. And he advocated to expanding suffrage. Don't get too excited. His advocating for expanding suffrage only was to really reach all white men. So what we started to see was we're going to take away the property qualification, but you still need to be a white male in order to vote. And one of the reasons he wanted to do this was because he himself didn't see himself as a son of privilege. He saw himself as someone who's almost self-made. He rose through the military through various ranks to move up to then become a part of Congress, and then obviously later on then to become president of our country. So he's the one who will first call for the end for the property requirement to vote. So we do see what's commonly referred to as universal male suffrage become a reality during this time period. And we also see voter turnout increase. And that's something really important as we're continuing with this stream tonight. Just because people have the right to vote doesn't mean they're actually going out and utilizing that right. So at this point in time in the 1820s, yes, all white men have the right to vote, but we're not going to see them all going out to vote. But we do see the percentage of them, it is increasing, that more people at this point in time are voting than they ever have in the past. And that's obviously a good thing when we see voter turnout increasing. We're also going to see that in American history, there were a ton of different amendments that were put into place to increase or to give more people the right to vote. And so just going through some of these amendments that were put into place, if we're looking at the 15th Amendment, this is going to come after Civil War. It's going to be ratified in 1870, and it gives former slaves and free blacks the right to vote. And it's the first really federal mandate affecting state voting requirements. So when Andrew Jackson, talked about the fact that he was advocating for universal male suffrage, there was no congressional law, there was no constitutional amendment. It was still up to the states to say, okay, yeah, we kind of like what Jackson's saying, and we're going to go with it. So this 15th Amendment is going to be huge because this is the first time it's federally mandated that these voting rights, that African American men are going to be franchised and given the right to vote. And so that's going to be really important that that's going to take place. We're going to go into more specifically looking at African Americans and their right to vote, their right to suffrage in our next slide, because as much as the 15th Amendment might say, yes, African Americans are going to have the right to vote, there's still going to be limitations to that right to vote. 19th Amendment, that's going to be giving women the right to vote. So that's going to come around later in history. Woodrow Wilson will be president at the time. But women from the 1800s on are really out there advocating for the fact that they deserve the right to vote. And it's also women, too, who become a main part. One of the reasons that the women's right to vote takes a little bit longer is we see a lot of women join up in the abolitionist movement and fight for the abolitionist movement. We're also going to be looking, as we continue on, as the 26th Amendment. So that's going to change the voting age from what it currently was and make it a little bit different. And then we'll also look at the 23rd and 24th Amendment. We'll get into these more specifically, so I don't want to jump into them now. I think it'll be better when we talk about them in context. So looking at the African American suffrage. So I already mentioned the 15th Amendment is what gives African American men the right to vote. But even though African American men have the right to vote, what we're going to see is different Southern governments are actually going to pass laws to make it difficult for them to vote. So a lot of governments in the South are going to pass things such as literacy tests, and they're putting these in their state constitutions. So literacy tests, meaning you have to be able to prove that you can read to a certain level in order to have the right to vote. They're going to put things in place such as a poll tax. So this is a simple fee, meaning you have to pay money in order to vote. And then they're also going to put into place a grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause basically says that if your grandfather wasn't able to vote, then you can't vote. And for most African Americans, right after the Civil War has ended, most of their grandfathers didn't have the right to vote because of the fact that they were former slaves, and slaves didn't have the right to vote. So these are all things that really were put into place to hurt African Americans. So even though you have this 15th Amendment saying they do have the right to vote, there are going to be limitations to that right to vote that are being put into place. And so what we're going to see end up happening is something that's known as a white primary. And so the white primary, too, is a popular method for southern states to keep African Americans from voting. And so what would happen is state party organizations would set rules for their primaries, and they would define their membership as a white man's club. So what we end up seeing is by 1915, 13 southern states had established what is called the white primary. And it basically excludes African Americans from being able to participate in that primary process, which is how political parties choose their final candidate to run for presidential office, Senate office, whatever it might be. And so again, we just see, even though there's 15th Amendment has taken place, we see all these ways in which states are coming up with different laws to prevent African Americans from voting. We have two important court. This happened after Johnson pulled the troops out of the South. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so this is all during that period of Reconstruction, when we see Reconstruction coming to an end. It's very fascinating. It's funny because I teach APUSH as well, Dakota. And so in APUSH, we're just getting to the Civil War now, and then we're going to start talking about Reconstruction. And it's interesting how immediately after the Civil War, we see African Americans gain a lot of rights. And for the most part, a lot of these rights are really held intact. But then as soon as Johnson pulls those troops, as soon as we have Reconstruction coming to an end, we see that all those rights that they had gained after the Civil War are quickly taken away because of these different things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all these other things that are put into place to really limit African Americans. So that's a great point, Dakota. I'm glad you brought that up. So some important court cases that take place during this time period. So in 1915, there's a court case that's known as Gwynn versus United States. And in Gwynn versus United States, the Supreme Court rules the grandfather clause unconstitutional. So we finally are going to see that coming to an end. And then in 1944, these cats of mine, in 1944, the court is going to declare the white primary a violation of the Constitution. All right, guys, you gotta get down. And they're going to declare that a violation of the Constitution in the Smith versus Albright case. So what we're going to see here is the fact that with the grandfather clause gone, with the white primary gone, we're going to see an increase in the amount of African Americans who are able to register to vote. Now, until we get to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, we're still facing issues as far as African Americans who are not allowed to register to vote. But we do slowly see it getting better because of these two court cases. That will bring us to the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This is really the first bill since Reconstruction to address the whole issue of voter discrimination that's taking place. And it's going to establish what's known as the U.S. Office of Civil Rights. And this is going to be a part of the Justice Department. It's going to be seen as an enforcement agency. And basically, what this department's job to do is to listen. If you try to register to vote and you're not able to, this is going to give you the opportunity to file a complaint, and then that department will look into that complaint. We'll see the 1964 Civil Rights Act is also going to address voting. In the same year as the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed, we're also going to see the 24th Amendment passed. The 24th Amendment is going to be the amendment that outlaws poll taxes in federal elections. So now the grandfather clause is gone, the poll tax is gone, and we're going to see things, again, slowly start to improve for African Americans as far as voting is concerned. This is all going to culminate with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is actually passed while the other Johnson is president. Now we're talking about Lyndon Johnson. And this is really seen as the most effective bill to bring the Black populace into the political process. This law is now going to outlaw literacy tests. It's going to put states with low voter turnout under the eye of the Justice Department. It's going to give the Justice Department jurisdiction over states that had any type of voting test and less than 50% turnout in the 1964 election. So these states are going to end up becoming subject to federal election examiners, and that means they're just going to be investigated as far as, are there ways in which you are still preventing African Americans the right to vote? It's not necessarily for the exam important to know which presidencies happened then or no. You won't be tested on that type of information. Really good question. Just more important to know kind of the process and the timeline of the way voting rights improved for different segments of our American population. So what we're going to see because of this law is the fact that Black voter registration is going to end up increasing. We're going to see more Black Americans get elected to office. And this law that was passed in 1965 was expired in 1971, but we have seen Congress continue to renew this Voting Rights Act several times, again, to make sure that that right to vote is not being taken away from African Americans. Questions about anything pertaining to African American suffrage before we move on? So next thing that's really important to talk about is to talk about women's suffrage. Obviously, as a female, this is near and dear to my heart. So I mentioned earlier that the push for women's suffrage really began in the mid-1800s. And because it was up to states and to territories to really determine voting rights at this point in time, we did see some states that were allowing women to vote prior to anyone else. So Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah were the three first states that gave women the right to vote, Wyoming being the very first state to give women the right to vote. Come on, guys. We're going to see the 19th Amendment that's going to be ratified in 1920 is what's officially going to give women the right to vote. And it's really due in large part to people like Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, there were many women who were suffragists who advocated to get our right to vote. But Susan B. Anthony is seen as really one of the leaders of that movement. She spoke many times at political conventions, organized different associations, and really she was also going out sometimes and trying to vote even when women didn't have the right to vote. And a lot of times she would get arrested for doing this. So that's why, I don't know if you all recall the 26th. Oh, I'll get to that question in 1 second, Dakota. In the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton was running for office, a lot of women, after they were done voting, went and put their I voted stickers on Susan B. Anthony's gravestone. Just because of the fact that, you know, here we finally had a woman who was running for a major political party for president when it was, you know, less than 100 years ago that women got the right to vote. So that's really important. 2020, when we're coming up, so the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920. So we're getting into the 100th year of women having the right to vote, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, that it's only been 100 years. So really good question about Jeanette Rankin. You probably, you know, a Jeanette Rankin question, I doubt you would see. You know, sometimes it's strange, odd things are kind of thrown in there, but I would be surprised to see that. I mean, just important to know, you know, the fact that she was the first member or the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. She's someone that actually you would probably more see on an APUSH test, just because of the fact that she was always voting against war. So she was one of the only people who voted against World War I, and we see that later on in American history as well. So, but I would find it surprising if you saw her on at the AP Gov test. But great question. So just as far as voting and non-voting, I just want to see one thing real quick. Okay. So before I get into this voting and non-voting conversation, the one thing I do want to mention, because it's one of the amendments that I had listed on the front page that doesn't necessarily fall into a demographic per se to talk about. But it's important to understand that the 23rd Amendment is because of the District of Columbia. So the way the electoral college system works, the amount of electors your state has is the amount of senators you have, which is 2. Every state has 2 senators, plus however many representatives you have. So depending on the size of your state, that's where there's going to be a difference. The problem with Washington, D.C. is they don't have senators and they don't have representatives. So for a while, they actually didn't have any electoral votes. But with the 23rd Amendment, that's going to change. And so the 23rd Amendment does grant the District of Columbia electoral votes because there are citizens who live there, pay taxes just like any other state. So it's kind of crazy to think about the fact that DC would not have any electoral votes. But now, because of the 23rd Amendment, they do have electoral votes. And the way the 23rd Amendment reads is that the district shall appoint electors, but never more than those of the smallest state. So in this case, the smallest state in our country has 3 electors. So right now, the District of Columbia can't have more than 3 electors, and that's exactly how many they have, is 3 electors. So that's just important to understand. And then one other amendment, again, that was on one of those first slides that I didn't touch on because, again, it falls into kind of a wonky area, will be the 26th Amendment. So the 26th Amendment is what changes the voting age. So for a long time, the voting age was 21. And then we see, because of the 26th Amendment, the voting age gets changed to 18. This was done in the 1970s when you had the Vietnam conflict taking place. And rightfully so, a lot of people were protesting, saying, listen, if at 18 I have to sign up for the draft and you're sending me off to war, then I should be allowed to vote for these officials, these government officials who are making these decisions. So this was probably, to me, one of the smartest amendments to take place, besides women getting the right to vote, of course, and the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment. But this is an important amendment just for the fact that we see, that voting age being lowered, because if someone is able to go off and fight in war, then good golly, they really should have the power to vote. So now jumping into this slide, which is voting and non-voting. So voter turnout is going to be the number of voters who actually cast votes as a percentage of the voting age population. If we look at the late 19th century, that's when voter turnout was the highest in American history. What we have seen since then is voter turnout has sharply declined, meaning people just aren't going to vote. If we look at the years 1928 to 1968, in presidential elections, we're specifically focusing during that time period, voter turnout was about 60%, meaning 60% of those who were eligible to vote were actually going out and voting. When we move into the 1970s, when we see right now in the 1970s, more people should be able to vote because the voting age is down to 18, we actually see a decline in the voting population. It goes to 57%. A lot of people estimate that because of the fact that you had Watergate going on, you had Vietnam going on. People were just frustrated with government in general, and a lot of people were becoming apathetic and just didn't really want to go out and vote. From 1972 to 2000, we've seen that it's only been about 50% of the voting age population who actually gets out and vote, which is really sad. And in 2016, 59.3% of the voting age population voted for president. So that's kind of sad that we're hovering. I mean, 59.3 is an improvement from the 50% we have been seeing all the elections prior to that, but still 59.3% of the population really isn't a great number when we think about it in terms of how many people we would like to see getting out there to vote. With social media, with I think an enlivened younger population, I'm hoping to see the 2020 election might see a higher voting population get out to vote. We'll have to see. There's a lot of reasons though why people who have the right to vote decide not to do it. So as I mentioned earlier with Vietnam and Watergate, one whole thing is this idea of voter apathy, where sometimes people just have a lack of concern for the election outcome. And there's different reasons why they might have this lack of concern. There are some people who believe that their vote doesn't count because of the Electoral College. There are some people who believe that no matter who's in office, things aren't going to change, that it doesn't really make a difference. So there's a lot of reasons why we see that voter apathy. But the unfortunate part is the fact that it keeps people from going to the polls and casting their ballots. We also see this issue of political efficacy. And this is the whole idea that their vote that some people feel as though that their vote doesn't make a difference. And some people feel as though, again, that whole idea, they're not going to see any change no matter who they vote for. So why participate and vote in the next election? So these are all reasons and things that keep people away from voting. So hopefully none of these will affect you, and you all, when you turn 18, will get out there and utilize that right to vote that so many people fought so hard for all of us to have. Take a second just to get a drink here, but if you have questions, pop them in. Otherwise, we're going to jump into talking about demographics. Dakota, that's awesome. So you'll be voting in 2020? You'll be 18 for that? Yes, very cool. Always exciting when you get to vote in your first presidential election. It's definitely something you don't forget. All right, so as far as demographics are concerned, we're going to look at all different types of demographics. And I turned it, oh, congratulations. So that means you'll even get to vote in the primaries too, which is pretty cool. You'll get to experience that. So that's a great thing as well. So you'll get to one vote in prior to the big presidential vote. Very cool. So as we're looking at demographics, just know that sometimes another word for demographics, especially in terms of voting, is voting blocks. It just means that we're going to be looking at groups of people based on certain characteristics and the fact that those groups of people might tend to vote in noticeable patterns. These cats. So let's start off as we're doing this by talking about gender. So one of the easier ways to divide and analyze voters is along gender lines. The gender gap is kind of the difference in political views between men and women, and how these views end up being expressed at the voting booth. So women tend to oppose harsh punishments and the death penalty more than men. They tend to favor government spending on welfare, and they are less war prone. So these leanings have resulted in more women voting with the Democratic than the Republican Party. Now, of course, there's going to be outliers to all these situations, right? So you might be thinking to yourself, well, my mom's a Republican, or my mom is okay with the death penalty, or whatever it might be. These are just generalizations. In general, we can say this about women. But again, there's always going to be outliers to everything we're talking about tonight. So just keep that in mind. Men tend to believe in harsher punishments against accused criminals. Okay, good question, Dakota. I'll jump into that in a second. Let me just finish about men here. Men tend to want to be more fiscally conservative, so they have a tendency to vote Republican. If we look at the 2016 election, 53% of men voted for Trump and 41% voted for Clinton. For women, 54% voted for Clinton and 42% voted for Trump. So yeah, if you look at the women's vote, especially in that last election, Dakota, where we had 54 for Clinton and 42 for Trump, we definitely did see a split amongst women. A lot of times what you could do, so like gender is one demographic, right? If you add in other things to demographic, like married or single, education level, right? That's where we can tend to break women down more across whether or not it would end up being Republican or Democrat based on those other factors. But again, these are just generalizations. But yes, in the last election, we did see more of a split in the women's vote. If you look, is it based on that specific election? So it's based on that specific election. Prior to that election, we didn't see such a split. And even if you go to the midterm elections that took place a little over a year ago, the midterm elections are showing less of a split and more of, again, women voting Democratic and not so much Republican. Doesn't mean we still don't have a good 30% that vote Republican, because we do, but we're not seeing that split be as even as it was in the 2016 election. And there's a lot of factors. I mean, we could do a whole class just on the 2016 election and analyze all those different factors, because there's a lot of things that were in play there as to why that vote might have been split at that point in time. And there's a lot of people that say if you look at the midterm elections and the fact that women now are leaning again more towards the Democratic Party, it's because of things like the women's marches that have been taking place because of the Me Too movement, different things like that. But great questions, Dakota. So age is another important thing to do as well as we're talking about this. Actually, you know what? Before I go into age, let me just go back a little bit more into this gender thing, because I had mentioned a little bit about the fact that sometimes with women we can see it mattering if you're married and unmarried. And so what we see going back to the past few elections, we look at the 2000 election, unmarried females strongly voted with the Democratic Party because they tend to care more about healthcare, employment, education, job security, retirement benefits because they're not married. And then if you look at the 2016 presidential election, 56% married women voters chose Trump compared to 42% for Clinton. So that married, unmarried thing is a huge thing. Unmarried female voters in the 2016 election by 62% margin chose Hillary Clinton. So that makes that marriage and single thing makes a big deal when it comes to women, not so much when it comes to men. And of course, we can analyze the psychology of why that is. As far as age is concerned, since the ratification of the 26th Amendment that lowered the age, we've had the lowest voter turnout than we've had in the past. So a lot of times people say that young voters don't come out to vote because of the fact that they just don't really have views of candidates or strong political views at this point in time. A lot of younger voters don't own homes, might not have a full-time job, might not be contributing a lot to income tax if you just turned 18. So a lot of people say that's why we tend to see lower voter turnout amongst the young population. Luckily, lately, though, we've seen this interest in politics increase, from the younger generation. So the hope is because of that a lot of times they group you from like 18 to 30. The hope is that 18 to 30 voting population will turn out more so than they ever have in the past. And we see that, in the last election that did take place, that the 2016 election, about 46% of those ranging in age from 18 to 29 did turn out to vote. So we're hoping to continue to see that increase, especially as younger people get more engaged in politics. In the 2020 election, let's try to get that number above 46%. And we do tend to see, if we look at the younger generation and senior citizens are the ones who are going to vote in the highest numbers. They usually have about a 72% voter turnout as a senior citizen, which is really impressive that they do that. And whereas our younger generation tends to vote more Democratic, our senior citizens tend to vote more Republican. Go figure, right? One never knows how these things are going to work out. Minorities, this is another demographic that's really important. And when we're looking at minorities, we're going to break it down into several different groups. But the one thing we can say in general is that minorities are increasing as a percentage of our U.S. population. So it's really important that we do see their numbers increase as far as voters. We're starting to see that African American voters are outnumbering white voters. At least for a little bit they did, but then we're starting to see it now kind of decline again. So if we're looking at African Americans in general, obviously we've already talked about how it took time for them to receive the full right to vote because of all the limitations that have been placed upon them. But now that those limitations are now gone, we're starting to see, especially when Barack Obama ran for president, we started to see that many African Americans went to vote. It's estimated in the 2012 presidential election that 95% of voting eligible African Americans voted. That is huge, 95%. That's a huge number. So that's very important. And it's in that election that we saw African American turnout surpass that of white voter turnout. So we're hoping to see that this number is going to continue to increase in other elections, because it did dip after Barack Obama wasn't running for office. As far as Hispanic Americans are concerned, this is the fastest growing minority party in the United States. And so their voting rights are hugely important, and them having a voice is hugely important. We tend to see that the Latino voting population does side with the Democratic Party on urban, minority, and labor issues. The one caveat to that is a lot of times we see that Cuban Americans will have a history of voting for the Republican Party. Obviously, with all the discussion about various immigration laws taking place, you might see that impact the way many Hispanic Americans end up voting, especially if you think of the immigration laws that tend to impact those coming from South America. Asian Americans, when we're looking at Asian Americans, they make up about 3% of our U.S. voting population. If you move over to the West Coast, that is a little bit higher, because you have a higher number of Asian Americans living on the West Coast. In 2012, it showed that about 73% of Asians voted for Obama. And so we do see some Asian Americans voting predominantly Democratic. Moving on to religious affiliation. So religions, because you tend to share like specific beliefs, right? Especially religious beliefs, a lot of times you tend to vote in groups as well. So just breaking it down, if we're looking at evangelicals, so these white are folks who tend to be white. They're born again evangelical Christians. They're the second largest religious group in our country. They tend to be much more conservative, and so therefore they've become huge supporters of the Republican Party. And what we saw in the 1970s was they joined what was known as the religious right. And so if you think of like televangelists, who tend to lead more conservative, family-oriented groups, again, which kind of kicked off during this 1970 time span, they do tend to vote mostly Republican. They come from the South and the Midwest, and they've been huge, huge, huge supporters of Donald Trump. And in the 2016 election, if you're looking just at the religious background of a person, about 80% of all evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. That's really where he gets a huge base of support from. Catholics are also a huge group, almost as big as evangelicals, not quite. Catholic voters have historically voted with the Democratic Party, but today we kind of see them jumping back and forth between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In Texas, it depends on where they live, because in Dallas County, where I live, the Asian American population votes more for Republicans. Oh, that's very interesting, Dakota. I wonder what that has to do with, might have to do with the line of work they're in. I don't know if in those two counties, if, one county over another tends to lend itself to a specific type of career. A lot of times with Asian Americans too, a big thing with voting looks at how long they've lived here in the United States. So Asian Americans who have lived in the United States for 10 years or less are the ones who tend to vote more Democratic. Sometimes if, they're second generation or they've been here longer than 10 years, that's when you might see them tend to vote more Republican. So I'm not sure if that has to do with the counties. If one county tends to have, a newer population of Asian Americans living there or not. I mean, that's just a stab in the dark, but that is something that we've seen as far as Asian Americans, and where there might be a split in their vote, depending on how long they've been here in the United States. But obviously workforce would matter too. State rep, and she's a Republican, and she's a Chinese immigrant. Has she been here more or less than 10 years? If I don't know if you know that information or not. She's been here, yeah. So what they tend to say is if you've been here 10 or less, you tend to be Republican. So because she's been here 10 or less, you tend to be Democratic. So because she's been here for 40 years, she would fall more into that Republican demographic for Asian Americans. So that could be why. And again, she still has a really strong. Yeah, well, if she grew up with her family, especially because her parents probably had strong accents, maybe her siblings. That's a great thing, though, that she's able to still hold on to the heritage of where she came from. Because sometimes it's sad. It's definitely always sad when people lose the heritage of where they came from. Jewish Americans, so they vote in large numbers. They tend to vote mainly with the Democratic Party. It's a Southern Asian accent, yeah. Because it's interesting because a lot of times, again, with the Asian American population, you see a larger majority on the West Coast, more so in California and Washington than you would like in the South and Texas. So Jewish Americans tend to vote in large numbers. They vote mainly with the Democrats. They comprise a small fraction of the electorate, only about 2%, but their participation is higher. So there might not be as many voting eligible Jewish Americans in the United States, but many of them vote. And it's estimated that they tend to vote 10% higher than the general population. And again, Jewish Americans tend to vote more for the Democratic Party than they would the Republican Party. But again, there's always outliers to all these different situations. And then just looking at businesses, laborers, and unions, it's just important to understand that small business owners, a lot of times they want less regulation, they want less interference, they want lower taxes. So a lot of times you'll see that small business owners tend to vote Republican because of that. Even large business owners, CEOs of companies, again, wanting lower taxes, they're going to tend to vote more Republican. If you contrast that with the people who are kind of doing the work in a lot of these companies, so like the wage earner, the factory workers, a lot of times because they're associated with labor unions, we tend to see labor unions vote more Democratic. Teachers tend to be aligned more with the Democratic Party than you would see other professions as well. Outliers to every situation, but again, these are just generalizations we can kind of make. Questions before we move on to voting models. So these voting models are just I've heard even though President Trump is a Republican, he supports unions. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say for sure about that. I mean, I think we've seen situations where President Trump has definitely stepped in to try to stop strikes that were taking place. I wouldn't say he's 100% fully backs unions like you would see in a Democratic candidate, but I wouldn't say he shuts down or wants to close off unions either. So with some Republican candidates, we've seen that they don't like unions in general. I wouldn't make that statement about President Trump, but I wouldn't say he's a big-time supporter of unions either. He's probably even, there's a good chance he's even. I mean, I think a good way of looking at it is when it comes time for endorsements, like in the 2016 election, and we're starting to see with this upcoming election, the unions themselves are endorsing the Democratic candidate because they feel as though the Democratic candidate will support them more. Again, not saying that Trump won't support them, but in sense of who is going to give them more support. When it comes to unions, it's usually going to be the Democratic candidate, just because it's very hard for somebody to support both unions and to support the CEO. That's in contrast with each other. And, so you got to keep that in mind as well. And that's where things can get a little bit difficult. As far as voting models are concerned, so obviously demographic influences, we've just got done talking about all the ways in which demographics can influence the way in which you might vote. Let's look at how voting models might influence it. So rational choice voting, this takes place when a voter has examined an issue or candidate, evaluated campaign promises, platform points, and consciously decide to vote in the way that seems to most benefit the voter. So what matters most in this type of voting might mean much less to another voter. So a person who's doing rational choice voting is basically voting on the things that will best impact them as a voter, right? So if I'm going to vote and I'm looking at rational choice voting, I'm thinking about which candidate is going to best suit my needs and suit the ideas that I support. So that would be rational choice voting. Retrospective voting looks backwards at candidates' track records. So if there's a race, for president or whatever it might be, the person's going to consider. So if I'm looking at all the presidential candidates, I'm going to consider, what they've done in Congress, what they've done in their other jobs, to determine what they're actually going to do when they become, president of the country. So it's looking retrospectively at their life's work. A prospective voter is going to be someone who's kind of anticipating the future. They're going to look at candidates and the way that the initiatives the candidates have proposed, and they're going to think about, okay, if I back this person, what impact might it have based on what it is they're proposing. So prospective voters look ahead, whereas retrospective voters look behind. Party line voting would be people who specifically, if you're a Democrat, when you walk into the voting booth, you just go straight down through all the Democratic candidates. Same thing if you're a Republican, you're probably not even looking up about the candidates. You just know if they're running for the Republican Party and you're a Republican, they're going to believe in what you believe, and you just go do. So it's not taking into account anything else besides the political party of that candidate. And then sometimes people will specifically look at the candidates and their issues, and we're starting to see more of this lately in our country, where instead of party line voting, we're starting to see people kind of say, okay, you know what? For president, I like this candidate from this political party, but for senator, I'm going to choose a candidate from the other political party. And they're specifically looking at the candidates and what they stand for, and not so much basing it on the political party itself, which would be nice if more people did that, right? We shouldn't really be using political parties as a basis for voting. We should be looking at the candidates themselves and what he or she might stand for and what he or she might do for this country. Questions before I move into our last, nope, I have 2 more slides, that's a lie. Question before I move into our second to last slide, which is going to be about government policies and voter participation. Okay, come on, Johnny. Just going to throw this cat down, and then we'll continue. Okay, so as far as government policies and voter participation, so just some important laws that have taken place. The National Voter Registration Act, which is also known as the NVRA, this was passed in 1993 to increase citizen participation and to alleviate the burden of having to make a special effort to register to vote. It's also known as the Motor Vehicle Law, so it addresses a lot of standards and enforcement of voter registration. So the law requires states to offer citizens a chance to register, such as places like the motor vehicle company. So probably, Dakota, maybe when you went to get your license, you were able to register to vote at the same time. I don't know, even though obviously you wouldn't be 18. Well, at least in New Jersey, you get your license at 17, but when you get your license, you can register to vote. So when you do turn 18, boom, it's already going to be in place. And so what we've seen is it's estimated that about 21% of voters tend to register to vote in this way. They can do it, at their motor vehicle company, which makes it a little bit easier rather than having to do it at a separate place. So the whole intent of that law, again, is to get more people to register to vote. The Help America Vote Act, this was in 2002. It's sometimes referred to as HAVA, H-A-V-A, and it imposes a number of requirements on states, mostly to create national standards for voting and election management. It says that all states had to upgrade their voting systems to an electronic format. This was because of Florida and the Chads. The law required states to replace punch card and lever systems and provided funds for the changeover because a lot of states just couldn't afford to do it for a while. It also addresses voting for people with disabilities. States and counties must make polling places accessible for blind people and those with physical handicaps to ensure full participation in the electoral process. And again, a lot of this has to come from the hanging Chad debacle that took place in Florida in the 2000 election, which none of you were probably alive for. As far as voter ID laws are concerned, what we're starting to see is a lot of states are talking about implementing some type of law that you have to show ID when you go to vote. I, again, live in New Jersey. When I go to vote, I do not need to show an ID. I just need to go in. They have my signature on file. I have to sign. They match those up, and then boom, I get to go and vote. And there's a lot of pros and cons to voter ID laws. Again, something else we could spend whole period or whole stream just talking about those pros and cons because there's definitely a lot to it. And then finally, our last slide for tonight, the different types of ballots that are used in this country. So the Australian ballot, it was known as that because it was first used in Australia. I think I want to say in the 1870s it was first used there. But it helps make elections more fair. So the ballot must be printed and distributed at public expense. It shows all candidates' names. It has to be available at the polling place. And it means you get to vote in private. You get to vote secret ballot, technically. This replaced other situations. Gosh, our country was a mess for a while where you would use color-coded cards to vote. At one point in time, you had to write the name of the person you were voting. So this just streamlines the process for everyone and makes it a little bit easier by using the Australian ballot. States also offer what's known as provisional ballots. A provisional ballot can sometimes happen because maybe your registration records are incomplete or incorrect. Maybe your name's been purged from the voting rolls because you haven't voted in a few years. Maybe you've moved from one precinct to another and the change never took place. So a provisional ballot is when you go to vote and they tell you you're not able to. And so what happens is you can fill out a ballot and then a commission will investigate whether or not you should have been voting. And then if so, then that vote will count at that point in time. Absentee ballots, I did this when I was in college. I went to school in DC. I wasn't going to be home in New Jersey on election day. Yeah, very cool, Dakota. That's exactly what I did. And so I was able to get an absentee ballot. It's very easy. They send it to you wherever you are. You fill it out, complete it, and you just plop it in the mail and send it on back. And so it makes life easy. It allows you to vote while you're out at college learning, but you're still able to participate in the entire process. As far as online voting is concerned, we don't have it. Because obviously people are afraid of the hacking that could occur with online voting. But there are some people who are talking about how we could increase the voting population in our country if we added it. You're still staying in Texas. Yeah, but Texas is a huge state, right? So it probably would be a distance for you to go back and vote, I'm assuming. But yeah, so online voting, we don't have it. I don't think it'll be coming anytime soon just because of the fact of it's not really safe at this point in time. Yeah, 3 hours is too much. Dakota, that brings up another good point too. One thing that people have said about voting, because we're constantly talking about how it is that we can increase voting in our country. And some people have offered a couple different scenarios. Some people have said, well, one thing we could do is extend it so it's not just one day, right? So maybe voting goes over a week's time or something like that. So that way people have opportunities to go and vote. And then some people say, well, if we put it on the weekend instead of a Tuesday, right? You driving 3 hours on a weekend is one thing. You driving on a Tuesday when you have classes is a little bit hard. So yeah, as far as early voting is concerned, not all states actually have early voting. That's only in some states that they have it. So again, I'm from New Jersey. We didn't have early voting. The first time we had early voting was when Hurricane Sandy hit us. Because things were such a mess here, they allowed us to do early voting at that point in time. But not all states have that. But yeah, early voting would make a lot of sense and make things a lot easier, because the whole idea here is that we should be wanting to find ways to get people to go out and vote, right? We should be encouraging voting, because the people who lead us are supposed to be representing the entire country. And in order to represent the entire country, we need, the entire country taking part in this. And again, we only have about 59% of the population going out, 59% of the population who are eligible to do so going out to vote. So that needs to be fixed. Ask us any questions you might have, suggest streams, tell us how much you love Fiveable, and how much it's helping you in your AP courses. That's always something that's great for us to hear. Any questions or anything I can help you with tonight? Otherwise, all right, and I will see you all probably the first week of December then. So enjoy your holiday with family and friends. Have a great night.